So we'll go ahead and kick off today's session. It's all going to be about research and partnerships. You're going to hear from quite a few university folks that are working with state and federal agencies and some of the research and development work that they've been doing. And remember your homework for this afternoon. Everyone, be sure to be jotting down some notes. What are you going to learn from each of these? What did you learn yesterday? What are your main takeaways? What are you going to bring back to your state or agency when you return? So be sure to be keeping your pens handy and jotting down some notes for this afternoon as well. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to grab a cup of coffee. I want to hear lots of good questions and discussions. So be thinking about good questions today too as well. All right, so we're going to kick it off with Amber Trueblood. She is an associate research scientist at the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. And Scott Valentine actually alluded to her work in his presentation yesterday. She's doing some large truck crash reporting and the MMUCC fifth edition work. Her research interests include improving data collection and quality, large truck involved crashes, occupational crashes, vulnerable road users, and impaired driving. And Amber, if you are online with us, if you can unmute.
As Brenda mentioned, I am an associate research scientist at the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. I am currently co-leading 2 projects looking at MMUCC and large truck crash reporting in Texas and NHTSA Region 6. I co-lead these with Eva Ship, who will be presenting on her rural truck project after I present this morning. So lots of good information coming out this morning. Before we get started, I do want to acknowledge FMCSA for funding both of these projects. Rodney Baumgartner and Bettina are our 2 project managers, and Scott Valentine is our subject matter expert and a great asset to have for this work. So let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to be telling you, or I'm going to be telling you about both of our projects with really the intention to highlight the benefits of MMUCC and why we are doing the projects in regards to CMV crash reporting. And so what is MMUCC? A lot of you guys have heard of it, and I see that a lot at conferences, that it comes up in conversations, but no one quite understands what it is. So MMUCC is a voluntary guideline that represents a minimum model set of data elements that should be to describe a crash that are recommended to states to start collecting. And its ultimate goal is to encourage greater crash reporting uniformity. So as you guys probably know, the problem with crash reporting is that Texas crash reports aren't equivalent to those being collected in New Mexico. The fields are different. We do have FARs for fatal crashes, but if you wanted to compare overall crashes, it gets very complicated to streamline and make those crash data sets uniform in nature. So MMUCC recommendations, if states were to implement, would actually increase that uniformity and handle that problem. So a little bit about the large vehicles and hazardous materials section. It's actually a new MMUCC section added in the 5th edition. And so why it was actually added to enhance the quality and accuracy of crash data, specifically for large vehicles and hazardous materials. But what's very novel about this is that it incorporates elements of up to 3 trailing units. This would be the first federal database to have this if they were incorporated, which would be a huge win for CMV crash analysis across all states. Trailers, I think, are a significant problem. I know for most of NHTSA Region 6, trailers are a problem, and I'm going to assume for the other states, I haven't seen your data dictionaries. But having trailer information really allows us to start looking at trailer use and safety in regards to these large vehicles. So 2 projects we have. The very first one is just really an assessment to look at how MMUCC 5th edition is for the large vehicle was incorporated into the Texas CR3, or where there were areas for improvement. And so the ultimate goal of that is to give Texas data stakeholders recommendations for future CR3s or crash form edits to help align to that MMUCC 5th edition for the large CMV sections. This project arrives because we had prior work that showed we have CMV underreporting in the state. In addition, we have some small issues with data quality on that CMV section. And so really figuring out what can we do to align, get rid of some of those problems. Project number 2 expands on this, and we really want to look at a whole region and identify best practices. And so it consists of NHTSA Region 6. We are looking at how are states integrating MMUCC and conducting the large vehicle and hazardous materials assessments as well, so we know how states are comparing to each other. But in addition, reaching out to data stakeholders and asking how they're integrating MMUCC recommendations into crash form edits over time. And so there's a lot going on there for our projects. And so why would we do all of that? And I think that's what you guys are really interested in. And so essentially the first is to identify attributes and elements that partially align. So we're going through the crash forms, and these partially are ones that could potentially be easier to align. So a good example is weather. Most states collect weather, but they aren't comparable across the line because they use different definitions, categories. And so if we can identify those, and like specifically Texas, we can make recommendations for future recommendations to help align that work. The second is really to identify existing attributes and elements that are already aligning with MMUCC to make recommendations for other states. And I think leveraging other states' lessons learned will really help states as they start making crash form edits. And so that's the benefit of both of those projects there. And ultimately, we aim to answer these questions for states to make integrating MMUCC easier, as well as to improve CMV crash reporting. And yep, that's the final take home for the why of this project is we want to improve and expand CMV data collected on police crash reports. And I strongly believe that can be done through increased implementation of MMUCC. And this would, really help make it so our data talks to one another. You heard yesterday that apparently Texas and New Mexico, at least on law enforcement, have a little beef. I wasn't aware of that. But what it would allow is if New Mexico and Texas were collecting the same CMV fields, we could compare crashes. And it's really important, especially when you have states sharing borders and vehicles crossing those borders, that you can make those comparisons. I don't have any beef with New Mexico. I just heard yesterday that there may be some potential. The New Mexico crash data people are seriously the best in the whole world. So that's my state on that. So I want to tell you a little bit about the protocol so you understand the project, but I don't want to get too far in the weeds from a method standpoint, because that's not the point today. I'm really here today to tell you about the benefits of MMUCC and what we've learned so far in our process. And so first, we developed a spreadsheet to score. We developed a scoring system that is slightly different than the MMUCC recommendations, which I'll get into. We obtain required documents for the assessment, and then we conduct the assessment. And so the assessment spreadsheet comes straight out of the MMUCC mapping Excel spreadsheet that's posted. It's a publicly available spreadsheet for each state to use. We actually modified it slightly though. So it went from the orientation. So we listed everything vertically because that's what we thought would be best for our scoring system. And essentially the picture depicts what we did. We went through each of the attributes and elements and cross-referenced to crash data documentation and said yes or no present. So that's what the red X and the green checks mean. A little more complicated, but that's the gist of that. And then we had a traditional scoring system. And so we used a yes, no for the traditional MMUCC score. Did it map? Did it not map? And then we have a modified MMUCC score, and the equations are shown here, but you don't really need to get into the weeds there. And the modified actually gives a 0.5, so a half a point, if there's an element that partially maps. And so that allows us to really identify those areas where it's there, but it needs some work to fully align to the MMUCC recommendation. And then again, we obtained required documents for the assessment. It's really important you get every single document possible. So it's very important that you're talking to the data stakeholders to ensure you have the correct manuals and all of that. Don't do a MMUCC assessment using anything that's publicly online because it may not be updated, as you guys are probably aware. So that's the one caveat there for academics listening. And then we conducted our assessment, and to make sure that this was done correctly, and this was actually modified slightly due to COVID-19. It was originally that we would do the assessment together in a room going through documents. Instead, we modified this to have 2 independent reviewers conducting independent assessments, at least 2. This year, we expanded to have 3 reviewers to help when we align back. We followed rules and the MUCC 5th edition. So all of this is available. The document has guidelines for if you're going to be mapping and how to follow that and make decisions. And then once we have the 2 independent or the independent reviews, we have at least a 3rd party come in to align the assessments and confirm there are no discrepancies. And so if someone says that an attribute's not there and someone says it is, a 3rd party comes in to make sure we know if it is or is not there. And luckily we have very few discrepancies. And so that's the good news on that. And so preliminary findings. This is a lot of information. So we go through each element and attribute, and I'm not going to go line by line and tell you what each one means, but I want to highlight what the modified score means here. Because if you were to do traditional MUCC assessment, almost all of them, Texas, this is from Texas, we get 0%. However, if you look at the modified score, you can see we actually have some really good partials that are there. And so, for example, our trailer information is collected, but it's not collected to the recommendations for MUCC. You have to play with the Texas data to really get what MUCC's asking for. But those are recommendations we can make back to our Texas data stakeholders that when you are doing CMV edits to the crash form, you may look at these fields and do X, Y, and Z to align. So that is the purpose of that. I'm trying to keep us on time because I know it's still early and we have a lot of good presenters. So recommendations. So the so what? So what did we find? And so we did find that you can modify partially present elements and attributes. So those are all going into recommendation reports that we will get to our data stakeholders through either reports or presentations. So specifically in Texas, we presented to the Traffic Records Committee on our findings so that they could start considering those as they make form edits. The next step really though is to determine the feasibility of adding missing MUCC elements and attributes. And so that's the big struggle of crash reporting is as crash analysts, I want all of the data, but that's not feasible for our officers. And so it's a balance because the crash form can only be so long. And so the next for any of the missing CMV attributes is determining the feasibility of adding or seeing if you can identify other potential data linkage sources to reduce the officer's work to get that information. And that is something that we explore on some of our other projects that did actually come in to tie in here is actually using linkage to obtain some information. So both of these projects are still in progress. And so our next steps are to finish the regional assessments for the second project. And then we will actually be reaching out to stakeholders in multiple states to identify best practices and their lessons learned as they start to integrate MUCC into the crash forum. And so there's a lot of work still ongoing. And then the very last is making sure we get these results out to the data stakeholders, the individuals who are designing the forms. And that is it for today. So I have time for questions if we have it on y'all's end, Brenda.
Great, thank you, Amber. Appreciate that update. Yeah, I think the point you made about just being able to easily compare crash data, across state borders is very important because that tends to be an issue. Just you have to be careful with what the fields mean in the various states when there's not that uniformity. So I think my first question is anyone here or online in your state aware that you guys are also looking at trying to do some of this MUCC uniformity with your crash reporting? I know it's a lot of work, so I'm sure you may be thinking about it, but maybe haven't quite started implementing it yet. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have heard of MUCC before this morning? Okay, good. Want to make sure there's at least a few folks that actually heard of MUCC. That's a good thing. So Amber, I know you've done some preliminary findings. Do you have any idea of what other states are doing in regards to MUCC?
When we talk to other stakeholders, we hear that they're starting to implement MUCC recommendations in other fields. The CMV has not been touched. And I think part of that is because it's a relatively new addition to the MUCC guidelines that came out in the 5th edition. And so I think as CMV stakeholders, we really have to push and say, this is here, let's try to streamline it and show the benefit of having that uniform data across states. And it gets really important with those state borders with CMVs. Those are one vehicle where it is important for us to know what's going on, especially with the states that share those borders. So MUCC is slowly being integrated for non-CMV, and I'm hoping we integrate CMV soon.
And then one other follow-up question. How are you getting the recommendations out to your stakeholders?
So for the first project, it's presentations as well as actually sending all of the project reports to the TxDOT crash reporting section. And that's the group in Texas who decides on form edits so that they have our findings when they actually go to make CR3 edits in the state. And then for the second project, we will actually be developing a best practices report that is disseminated to all of the data stakeholders in our region, as well as made publicly available through a website. And then our intention is to go to as many conferences as possible to really show those best practices and lessons learned to try to make the job easier for other states. Because it's you, when you're looking at MUCC, you're looking at a giant hill that you have to overcome, or mountain. But if we learn some of those best practices from other states, we might be able to take them to the top of the hill to make it a little bit easier.
Great. It looks like we do have a question here.
Hello. So my question is regarding training, especially in Texas. There's a lot of CMV and crashes. There's a lot of agencies, though, and officers that might cover those crashes. So is your group thinking about training, and how do you train all the different agencies to get consistency in filling out this new form? And then one additional question is how do you adjust their computer systems? What effort is made to adjust their computer systems and their reporting capability, especially for agencies or counties that may not have as much money?
That is a great question. So the MUCC is just a voluntary guideline that states can use to integrate into their crash form as they make edits. And so we don't actually do anything directly with officers on this project. It would actually go to the Department of Transportation in each state who handles the form. As they make edits, they push updates out to law enforcement agencies for new fields and things that are added. Now, in regards to training law enforcement, Eva and myself actually have a different FMCSA project that is focused on improving CMV crash reporting as it is in Texas. So we had a project about 3 years ago that we found CMV crash underreporting is a significant problem in Texas. And a lot of it becomes that officers, unless they're CMV trained or CVE guys, they don't know what goes in some of the fields. And so we have a lot of missing information for weight and things. And so that project is actually focused on developing a training series to go directly to law enforcement agencies and tell them about CMV crash reporting and what goes in each field. And so if in the future Texas or any of the other states were to implement more of the MUCC recommendations, similar approach would need to be handled, where you go and train officers to say, this is what each field means, this is what goes in each one. Please don't leave it blank. That's my number one plea. Don't leave something blank.
Great. Thanks, Amber. Dustin, do we have any questions online?
We do have a couple. The first one is, Amber, could you elaborate on truck trailer safety issues or concerns, such as do you feel multiple trailers are involved in more crashes or more serious crashes than single trailers?
So I haven't done an analysis recently looking at multiple trailers, but yes, we do know that multiple trailers are a problem on Texas roadways specifically due to some of our prior FMCSA work and large trucks. And the real problem, though, is with the multiple trailers, how they're entered. It's very hard for us to know what trailer number it is. And so in Texas, your truck tractor, maybe unit 1, 2, and 3 are trailers, but it doesn't actually tell us that 2 and 3 belong to unit 1. And so for us to use that trailer information, there's a lot of back-end data cleaning. Whereas with the MUCC recommendations, that would not be necessary. The trailer very clearly would go with the truck tractor, and we would know the trailer type. And that's another issue, is limited trailer information that we have in the state. And then I think there was another part of that question. Did I miss that?
Oh, you got that one. There's just one more question though. What
Okay.
version of MUCC is a Texas crash form currently? And are you trying to get them to go to version 5?
I believe Texas is version 3. And yes, we try to push all the time for them to go to version 5 or the most recent. But at the same time, we just hand over recommendations. And so a lot of the times our recommendations, we give a big goal, like this is what we would want, is to go to MUCC 5th edition for the whole form. That's not necessarily appropriate and not necessarily something they can implement. And so we completely redid we went from CR2 to CR3 about 10 years ago. And that was a huge ordeal in the state from a training standpoint and making sure we were collecting the right information. So a lot of the times our recommendations are those smaller ones. So we have something we're already collecting. Can we tweak the categories to align? And so I think we can sneak a lot of those smaller edits in before we can push a whole overhaul of the form.
Hey, Amber, Dan Murray with ATRI. Millions of years ago, we did some work zone research with your TTI colleague, Jerry Ullman, and collected up about 38 states worth of truck-involved work zone crashes, and it was rear-end crashes. And in almost half the states' data, we could not figure out who was rear-ending whom. Critical information in terms of design and tapers, et cetera. Do you have any sense at all whether that sort of issue is being resolved or has been resolved? They told us, CVSA was working on it, AMVA was working on it, Governor's Highway Safety was working on it, but we never really saw an outcome.
No, we're still really working on that to figure out who's rear-ending who. Now, some of the MUCC recommendations actually would resolve that if states were to implement them. But again, MUCC is not something that the feds are saying you have to implement. They're voluntary guidelines. And so a lot of the times, if we can identify a problem such as rear end or other information, and we have a resource like MUCC, we can actually propose, hey, look, they have a solution over here. But it is going to be a slow process. Anything dealing with the crash form is a slow process. Just to get implemented, because you have to make sure the form's collecting the information correctly and adequately. And so what we see a lot of the times is it takes years and years for fields to be added. And so I don't know when that project was with Jerry Ullman, but yeah, we're still working on it. And Eva can tell you more about that. She does a lot with the rear end crashes.
Great. Thanks again, Amber. Good questions, guys. Good job. I think
Yeah,
we'll
you
go
guys
ahead.
had your coffee.
I know. Yeah, they're a little bit more lively this morning. It's great. So I think we'll go ahead and move into your colleague's presentation, Amber, if
Brenda.
that's all right.
Brenda,
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Oh, we got one more question. Holly.
it's more of a comment versus a question. I know FMCSA, as part of their modernization, are working to incorporate a majority of the MUCC elements in the new safety net, or whatever it's going to be called, because they do want to collect all this information. And hopefully, when we have a platform that we can collect it, that it would be easier for the states to start going to that format in their crash forms, even though I know it will take many, many years for it all to be there. But hopefully, in the end, we'll all be able to collect all that information. That's all I have.
Great. Thanks, Holly.